Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining me in tonight's live stream, or today's, depending on where you are in the world. Can see some comments already. Hi Adrian, hi Areta. This is my first time here. Yeah, I'm super excited about this live stream. Again, thank you so much for joining. So, just a quick reminder. As usual, you are welcome to participate in the whole discussion. I will be checking the comment chat box periodically. If you have some thoughts to share, I'll be happy to read them whenever I can. And of course, if you have any questions, then whenever I can, I'll try to answer them. So, the subject for today, individuation. Individuation from this Jungian perspective, we know is about kind of ego development, where we embark on this journey of kind of integrating our past, integrating our unconscious into who we are right now. So Jung can kind of describe this process as a highly symbolic process, highly symbolic journey where we encounter different parts of our mind, or mind in general, depending how far we're going into that unconscious realm. So we know that different archetypes, different parts of our mind, like the shadow or the anima and animus, and then various collective archetypes like the Joker, or sage, or queen or king. So from this perspective, I can imagine that it can get a little bit complicated. And in my opinion, maybe Jung made it a little bit too complicated than it actually is in reality. And I think there might be a way to simplify this process. Having said that, I'm not saying that Jung was wrong, that he messed up the whole theory. Nothing like that. It's just, I think that there might be something simpler, some simpler path. So when he developed this theory of individuation, that was before days of the development of the theory of self-actualization. So self-actualization, we know in these modern terms, is kind of bringing forward your whole self and actualizing who you are as a person. So becoming everything that you can with the skills that you have right now. So being highly adaptable, highly flexible, highly creative, probably, where you take steps towards kind of actualizing your vision in the world as well. And I think that individuation and self-actualization might be either the same processes, or there might be some major overlaps. For me, I associate individuation with this highly kind of internal process where our ego develops, when the ego separates from the collective. So it is kind of internal, but at the same time there is this external or collective component to this process, whereas self-actualization is kind of bringing forward everything that you are in the world. So I'll leave that interpretation to you, whether you think that these two processes are the same, or whether they are kind of parallel, or whether you need to maybe individuate first before you can go through that process of actualization. So individuation, if we kind of solely focus on the word individuation, right, that brings us completely different meaning to what self-actualization is. So individuation, it's like Jung was describing it, is about this ego development. It's kind of becoming separate from the collective, from other people, from the social. So while we're becoming more and more autonomous, right? So in that process, it's not about completely isolating ourselves from the world, obviously, but in fact, it's more freeing, so that we don't operate through certain schemas, certain patterns when interacting with the world, with other people, with life in general. But we develop this choice. We develop this ability to choose. We develop this ability to be independent, to have free thought, regardless of what other people are thinking. But if we kind of focus on this internal process, ego development is kind of, again, about autonomy and flexibility. But on the internal level, from that Jungian perspective, it's kind of, emerging from the unconscious world. Now, we can get very complex with this. We can get into archetypes, we can get into the shadow, we can get into, all these dynamics, all these processes that Jung was describing. But if we focus on very practical level, what do you think, or how do you think that ego emerges from this unconscious? How do you think that the ego can become more autonomous? Or if you don't like the word ego, you could use just the word I. So it's a highly subjective process. How do you think it happens, right? In these more practical ways. So I think if we take into account what we know more about psychology, so like perception or the importance of language, like I was describing in the previous live stream, we see here that the individuation process is more about kind of developing more and more accurate perception and understanding and interpretation of who you are as a person and what is happening around you. So in that journey, you could use various symbols for what you encounter. But at the same time, I don't think you have to. I don't think it's necessary to use all this symbolism. Just checking my notes. So if we kind of briefly take a look at what the unconscious is actually. Again, you could use various symbolism. You could make it very complex, very symbolic, very metaphorical, which would be very helpful as well. But then you can simplify it. So unconscious, what goes into unconscious in a simple terms? Things like memories, right? Memories, that's a huge one. Our beliefs, right? But most importantly, this kind of automatic thought patterns or automatic ways of reacting to what is happening. So basically, if we kind of look at our past, what happened to us in the past, since childhood, right? We've been collecting these various experiences that shape who we are as a person right now. So all these experiences, all these memories, all these conclusions that we drew from our experiences since childhood, they started formulating different templates for acting in the world. So for example, in childhood, if you haven't been seen, for example, by parents, or if you felt that way, if your parents, for example, didn't give you that much attention, you're going to start believing that maybe self-expression is not right. Maybe it's not good for you, or maybe you cannot do it. So all these different little things contribute to how you start to interpret yourself, how you interpret the world, how you interpret different experiences in your life. Now, if you think about it, just think about it for a second, because this is, in my opinion, this is very, very important. Because if you think about all these schemas, all these patterns that shape your reactions, shape your relationships with other people, which, and all these patterns are usually unconscious. That's why they're pushed in the background, because they're automatic. We're not doing things consciously anymore. They're automatic. Then how can we, develop this agency and flexibility and adaptability in the world if these automatic patterns rule our actions and rule our behaviors? And most importantly, they rule our kind of self-understanding and who we are as a person. So to kind of give this little conclusion, then individuation is about simply freeing ourselves from these patterns, from these automatic ways of thinking, from these automatic ways of interpreting the world, so that we develop more and more accurate perception and understanding what is happening. So that when we are in relationships, for example, where we interact with people, when we make choices in life, we base these choices on what we really see and what is really happening, not what our unconscious mind is telling us that is happening. Because all these patterns, all these templates will influence how you see life, right? How you see yourself, how you see life. Just to read some comments first. right, working towards truly believing in your core that the way you were treated as a child actually flowed from the handguns of a caregiver. There was nothing wrong with us. Right. So there's this part of kind of attributing where certain things in our child could be coming from. So making that attribution, this is actually quite an important comment. Making this attribution, right, whether some belief or some cause of our action truly came from ourselves or how we were treated, I think it's quite important in understanding ourselves, because if we attribute absolutely everything to ourselves, even though, you know, certain things came from other people in childhood, then, you know, it might be quite difficult to actually take the responsibility when you can't fully understand what has been happening. So that's going to be the next part I wanted to talk about. So in terms of that, you know, individuation is all about this autonomy, and it's all about that awareness, kind of present moment awareness, where we look at ourselves in this present moment or any kind of moment, or where we simply take that kind of snapshot of our life, right? So that we can interpret things based on how they are. So not through our filter, not through our past experiences, not through, you know, certain schemas that we might be having, or certain beliefs, or certain kind of maybe blockages that we've experienced in childhood or later on in life, but by focusing on facts. And in my opinion, that is the core of this individuation process, where we develop more and more accurate perception, more and more accurate interpretation. So in that process, we focus on facts and what is really happening. And I think that's quite a tricky process, because, as I was saying, our unconscious, in a sense, can have can kind of hold a really big importance in how we interpret our experiences, where we are not really paying attention to how we do it, right? So the little introduction to this process was in my last live stream on language, and how we, you know, we might be repeating certain beliefs to ourselves, to our other people, without questioning how we are formulating these beliefs, how we are talking to ourselves, how this internal dialogue is really. So, you know, language and words can have a huge influence on this process. But also in terms of the unconscious having this influence on us, I think what happens is that basically from, for example, schema therapy perspective, we develop the schemas. So these are like a little bit like lenses that help us to interpret different situations. So in a general sense, it's good that we do it, that we have different schemas, because they help us to operate in the world quickly. So for example, if you know, I've seen movies or talked to people that would, you know, that would help me to, or talk to people that kind of share this information with me, that recognizing certain signs in the environment will help me to, you know, be safe. So if I see a person walking towards me with a knife, right, that's a schema, I feel that it's a threat to me. So schemas in a broader sense are very, very important to, because they can help us to move forward. They can help us to act quickly in the world. But at the same time, schemas can be very limiting if the schemas are not based on facts. So in schema therapy, you have this many different schemas, like, you know, abandonment schema. So you look for signs that you're going to get abandoned by someone in a relationship, or by your friend, or by your family. Or there's another schema about effectiveness, right? So kind of seeing yourself through this lens that there's something wrong with you. There are like, I think there are around 20-ish schemas in schema therapy. So this sort of things prevent us from looking at ourselves and at other people through this more objective way or objective lens. But when we use only the schemas, right, we are not seeing other people. And probably we are not even seeing ourselves. We are seeing some ancient beliefs or ancient kind of conclusions we drew from our past experiences. And instead of looking at present situations and what is really happening, we are using this lens of past experiences, past templates, and we interpret present situations, present experiences as they were exactly the same like in the past. So obviously there's no agency in this process, right? If we keep doing that, there's no agency in that. There's no adaptability either, because we are not having this connection with the reality, with the world, with other people, or even with ourselves. So this kind of schemas or patterns, however you want to call them, I think they can range in intensity. So for some people, there might be little things, right? Kind of clouding their vision, clouding their perception. But I think on a more intense end of the spectrum, they can really mess up with someone's life, because all that person is seeing is simply their past experiences, which are not true anymore, which are not happening really. So this more intense spectrum kind of relates to things like complex PTSD or certain personality disorders. So what happens is that when that person perceives the current situation, and they think that it's unconsciously think that it's something that happened in the past, that's going to provoke a very strong reaction. So we call them something called emotional flashbacks. So schemas and emotional flashbacks would be one of the things that might prevent us to individuate, might prevent us from being more autonomous, might prevent us from kind of developing this very accurate perception or perspective even, or more accurate interpretation of what is happening. Let's read some comments. Kelvin asks, what are practical exercises to understand the unconscious? I will get to this part in the last bit on this live stream. There is an actual schema of defectiveness. Yes, ETI. There is, if you want to go online and check on schema therapy, you will find a list of different schemas which relate to different needs that haven't been met as a child. So when that schema gets triggered in some ways, when you perceive little cues in the environment or in your experience that resembles the past, the schema gets triggered and you interpret the whole experience as if it was the same experience, the same situation from the past. That's basically how schemas work. Adrian shares, my superego sounds exactly like my father. Right, so I think this is super important that you are able to distinguish that and where this voice is coming from, because that helps you to kind of detach yourself from this, so that you see, okay, there's this voice in me that comes from father, for example. And the moment you do it, in that process that you do it, right, you put this barrier, maybe not a barrier, but you put this space between yourself and that part of you. So you can use this part if you want to, but at the same time, it doesn't fully define you. It's not like you are this voice. So this is super important that you are able to distinguish that. I think that another example of how our unconscious mind could be hijacking our experience or how our understanding or our interpretation is this process, again from psychoanalysis, called psychological projection. So projection can be a little bit complex to understand at first, but it's actually quite simple in practice. So with projection, let's say that one part of me has a standard of kind of saying that it's wrong to have a bad temper. But then another part of me has a bad temper. So what happens is that we can't hold the conflict. We can't stay in conflict like this for long periods of time. So what happens is we apply this defense mechanism. For example, psychological projection is just one defense mechanism out of many, but I think it's quite important in this subject we are talking about because it kind of influences our perception and understanding and our awareness. So what happens is that to resolve this conflict, we're gonna deny that we have a bad temper. And then in situations where, for example, raise our voice, or where we start getting angry, or where we throw things out of anger, however a person reacts, we're gonna say, no, I'm calm, right? There's nothing happening. But then we're gonna be going around and pointing fingers on other people who have perhaps a bad temper. We might start judging them, we might start criticizing them, we might start, telling them to change, that it's wrong to have a bad temper. So basically, instead of resolving this conflict internally, we attempt to resolve it by interacting with other people. That's like a basic foundation of psychological projection. So it is on the part of ourselves that wants to get angry in certain situations, right? We deny it, we don't have it, it's wrong to have it. But then we start, being judgmental or critical towards people who have it. So we might tell them to stop doing that or change, or that it's wrong. So projection in this way, you see, if we do that kind of, if we have these defense mechanisms, and trust me, most people have it, it's just with different in severity, we cannot understand ourselves, we cannot see ourselves, but most importantly, we cannot see other people. We see them through this lens of this conflict that we are having, or through this defense mechanism. So basically, all we see in the other person is our denied part. All we see in them is something that we don't accept within ourselves. So how can we even interact with people if we don't see them, right? Maybe they do have a bad temper, or maybe we are oversensitive. Maybe they have a right to get angry, and there's nothing wrong with that because they are separate from us, right? Or maybe we are kind of exaggerating the cues that we are getting. So again, psychological projection, something to be mindful of, when we especially get some strong reactions towards other people or towards certain situations. And even more relevant, I think, projection is in personal relationships, especially intimate relationships, because the kind of more involved you are with someone, the more you kind of bring into that relationship, the more of your unconscious rubbish is gonna start coming out, basically, because the other person is, they're gonna start triggering certain points of view, certain parts of you, certain reactions. And this is because, the most intimate relationship we've ever had in our lives is with our mother and with our father, but it's mostly mother. So basically, the more intimate we are with someone in adulthood, right, the bigger the chance they're gonna basically provide us with some clues on the past experience. So basically what happens is that we start to interpret that present situation in our romantic relationship as if it was someone that happened between ourselves and our mother. So this is another, probably would deserve another live stream, how that projection works in, intimate relationships. But, I just wanted to give kind of a brief mention because I think it's something to be mindful of. on a side note, I think romantic relationships are, or any, I mean, it doesn't have to be a romantic one. You could have a really good friend or a therapist or a coach or a counselor, someone who connects with you on this very deep level. Because, and it's super important because there is this opportunity for you to learn more about your unconscious. So then you can see, all right, is my therapist angry with me? Is my boyfriend or girlfriend disappointed in me, really? Or am I interpreting their reaction because they behave maybe in a similar way to how my mother behaved? So in terms of projection, I think this is very, very important to kind of keep in mind and be aware of. I believe projection is the result of weak superego and conscience and self-awareness, all of which are interconnected. It is an attempt to not become self-aware of oneself, right? It's like a defense against awareness, in a sense. So the different parts are in conflict, and you have to pick your side in a sense, but then that doesn't really resolve the conflict either. So you have to deny some part of you to resolve this conflict, something like a denial, Igor, or Yegor, not sure, but the pronunciation says something like a denial, yes. So it is a denial that we are not like that. All right, thank you for sharing. That's a really, really good point. So on my list, kind of go back to individuation. So on my list, we've said that kind of emotional flashbacks and kind of interpreting our present moment experience as if it's something that was in the past, and psychological projections, I think, are two major mechanisms that prevent us from individuating, and they kind of hijack our present moment experience, present moment situation that we are in, because we are then unable to interpret what is happening. We are, it's like living in virtual reality, in a sense, living in a bubble where we don't see what is really happening, where we don't focus on facts, but we use these old ancient templates to help us to interpret that experience. And I think the third item on that list I would like to add is kind of fear of change, or fear of freedom. So what I mean by that is a philosopher, Kierkegaard, called it a dizziness of freedom. So basically, when we have all the freedom in the world, when we can do anything we want, it might be very terrifying, because then we have to take responsibility for everything in our own personal sphere of life. Then we have to control things. Then we have to, bear the consequences of our actions. So I think this kind of fears of responsibility, of freedom, of free will, of, in a sense, autonomy and agency can be something that could prevent us from, in a way, getting in touch with the reality, or developing this more intimate relationship with the reality, with what is happening, and of course with ourselves. Because then we're going to start avoiding things, then we're going to start twisting our interpretations, right? So for example, we might say that, oh, that didn't happen, that doesn't matter, that didn't have any meaning for me, right? We might start denying that certain things are important to us, or we might go other direction and say that, for example, our feelings are not valid, right? Oh, it's wrong to get angry. Oh, it's wrong to get sad, right? So all these kind of little things like avoidance or denial or repression, all these little things that keep us in this familiar comfort zone where we are responsible for some things, but we don't have to be responsible for other things that require us to take greater agency or greater kind of willpower. And I think, I think this fear can be quite unconscious for most people, because everyone wants to be in control, right? We want to have control, we want to do what we want. But once we get that freedom, it can be terrifying, because then you encounter all this huge space in front of you, all this huge space of opportunities of what you could be doing with yourself and with your life. But to get to that point, you need to be able to face things about yourself that might be quite uncomfortable. Like, maybe you haven't got an opportunity, maybe you didn't get this opportunity to develop discipline, maybe you didn't get the opportunity to know how to manage your finances or manage your relationships, right? So to reach that point of agency and autonomy, where you can interpret your experience, where you focus on facts, right, where you are aware, or at least more aware, of what is going on around you, it requires to go through this little journey of encountering parts of you that don't want that freedom, the parts of you that are uncomfortable with controlling things in your life, maybe, or on the other end, kind of letting go of that control, because letting go, I think, is super important in this process as well. So once you start encountering these different parts of you that don't want that, and once you start realizing that, oh man, I could have been actually doing more with my time, like I actually have that skill, I'm actually more responsible for things in my life, for things happening in my life than I thought. So what sort of feelings do you think this encounters with provoke, right? Probably some concerns with self-esteem, maybe shame, maybe anxiety, because then you realize that you could have been more, you could have been doing more than you are doing right now. If not the fact that you deny yourself this freedom of choice or responsibility. So do you guys think, is there anything else we could add to this list of what might prevent us from individuation in terms of this idea of developing awareness and accurate perception, or things that simply could be hijacking our present moment experience? So how our past could be hijacking our experience right now. Or if you prefer, we could just focus on this kind of obstacles to individuation from this perspective that I've been sharing in this stream. So we have these three things for now: psychological projection, kind of flashbacks, different intensity, and kind of fear of autonomy and freedom, dizziness of freedom, where we can become overwhelmed with possibilities, where we might not want to become more independent, because that would mean that we are alone in the world, that maybe we are not as connected to other people as we wished. So I think that fear of independence and being separate from other people, I think that also could be another fear preventing us from individuation, because once you reach that point of independence and autonomy and agency in your life, right, where you don't have to depend on other people anymore, right, that could be a very lonely place to be in, at least at first, or at least from a perspective of the parts of our mind that are not as mature as we wish them to be. So is there anything else we could add to this list? Arita says, inability to trust our own judgment. Yes, so on this path of actualization or individuation, we need to be able to develop this self-trust. So from my perspective, I think that trust or self-trust is something that we develop over time. So it's not something that it's entirely there, especially if we're doing this work of personal development, but it's something that we develop over time as we receive more and more feedback on whether we are on the right path or not. And whether we are on the right path or not, in terms of that feedback, I think we can find out by taking kind of honest look onto whether we feel right. So it's a kind of, I think it's a feeling. and also what sort of outcomes there are in the external world of our actions. So basically, I think it's a leap of faith at the same time. So it is risky, right? So at first you might say like, I'm not sure if I can trust my judgment. But then, okay, let's test it. So you could treat it as an experiment, right? So at first you're not sure. At first you're not sure whether your judgment is correct, whether your perspective is correct. But then you take a leap of faith. Then you maybe simply commit to a little experiment. So I'm going to go along with my judgment and see what happens, right? If it's wrong, then, okay, I have to tweak something. There's a lesson for me, right? There is a lesson in a failure or a mistake or something that we are not fully satisfied with. So then you do it again, and then again, and then again. So basically, at first it might seem like a leap of faith, a little experiment, but then as you gather more data, you develop this self-trust, you develop this trust in yourself because you have an evidence that it's been correct. Yes, fears always, it always comes back to them, exactly. Because it's very scary to go outside of this comfort zone, right? Because everything is so familiar. Okay, so we have about 20 minutes, so I'm thinking about we can just move on to the last part of kind of strategies helping us with this individuation process from this perspective of developing more and more accurate perception, understanding, interpretation, from this perspective of kind of expanding our awareness. Because I think essentially this process of individuation is not just about development or, you know, meeting some developmental stages and goals, but on this very basic level, I think it's like an expansion of awareness. So we become more and more aware of who we are as a person. And then we also become more and more aware of other people, right? So as we withdraw our projections, as we work on seeing other people, not through the lenses of what happened to us in the past, but who they are as a person, right? So what is it that they are really doing, right? We could always ask them, right? It's all a process of this expansion of awareness. So we cast this light of consciousness onto things. We cast this light of awareness into things that haven't been present in our field of awareness before, right? So as we move through this process, we develop this greater agency because then we see more, right? We see the templates we've been operating in, we see the patterns, right? As we go through this process, obviously we develop more and more agency and autonomy, because then we don't have to act accordingly to these patterns, but we have a bigger field of choice. We have more choices as our awareness expands. Flatulent mind. I'm just coming in. Are you talking about development of the ego before beginning the process of individuation? So I'm talking from this perspective that individuation is actually, in a sense, a development of ego. So it's like this expansion of awareness so that we develop more and more agency and more and more autonomy in our lives, because we see things more accurately. We don't operate through this past patterns. We don't operate through this template. And I think it's like Jung said, it's a lifelong process, because there's going to be always something in the unconscious. We can't be aware of absolutely everything. There will be things, getting into our unconscious as we acquire new experiences. But as we expand our awareness, right, we can be quicker in spotting these things or seeing these things. So we can be quicker and more flexible and more adaptable to what is happening right now, because we have this better kind of relationship with our unconscious. We know what to look for. So if we kind of move to this last part, so I wanted to talk about more about these strategies. So we know projection, emotional flashbacks, fear of freedom could be the major, in my opinion, the major obstacles to seeing life realistically, seeing ourselves realistically, not through these lenses of past experiences. And obviously, as you probably know, as I've been talking in previous videos on this subject, I think the first key step is developing this meta-awareness. So you need to be able to observe yourself without sinking in to different states of mind, without sinking into different emotional responses. So this kind of meta-awareness, in short, I talked about it many times in previous videos and live streams, is like, basically it's like mindfulness. So basically you observe yourself, you observe what is happening right now, and you try to describe it to yourself as accurately as possible. So for example, if you have a strong reaction to your friend, take a step back, right? Pause for a second and ask yourself what is really happening. So you have some emotional reaction. Where is this emotional reaction coming from, right? We could be very quick and say that, oh, my friend annoyed me, right? That's the quickest, the easiest response. But then there is more to that. Is it really about your friend? Or do you have some belief associated with anger? Or do you have some fears of, getting specific emotional reactions from other people? So meta-awareness kind of allows you to take a step back and observe the whole situation without sinking into the pattern. So it's like, all right, take a break, right? Do a little pause before going along with the impulse to act in a certain way or the impulse to react. So if you'd like to know more about meta-awareness, I have some videos on mindfulness, on developing this meta-awareness. I'm sure you can find them in my on my YouTube page. Or if you like to, if you'd like to know more about it from a personal perspective, I'm available for coaching. If you're not sure whether coaching is right for you, you can schedule a free 20 minutes consultation, and I'll be happy to chat with you on what coaching is about and whether it could be beneficial to you. So meta-awareness, I think, is the very fundamental step we are taking in developing more accurate perspective, because it enables us, it frees us from these automatic patterns, from these automatic reactions, from these automatic ways of interpreting our experience. So without that meta-awareness, without paying attention to what is happening, without kind of witnessing ourselves and the experience from, 2 steps from a distance, we won't be able to probably do other things like changing the perception or changing schemas, changing beliefs. Miko asks, is it true that remembering the memory actually changes the memory? Then it is possible to change a schema in a way that might be helpful to individuation. Yes, from this perspective, yes, I'll totally agree with it, because when you remember the memory, that was actually the next bit I was going to comment. So as you apply this meta-awareness, as you become more and more observant of different patterns, I think very important step here would be to link a present situation with a memory. So the situation that you are in right now, for example, let's go back to this example of your friend annoying you. Can you recollect any situation from your childhood that has been similar? Can you recollect any situation that maybe had, a similar reaction that you received? Similar person, maybe similar characteristics. So as you remember this memory, you start to understand yourself better. You start to see that, I've been repeating certain patterns in my life because of that memory, because of that event, for example, or that memory could have been reinforcing my beliefs, or rather that situation in the memory could have, reinforcing my beliefs in life, because I haven't been aware of how I was making sense of that experience. I was just doing automatically. So yes, I would agree that yes, linking memories to present moment experiences, or even remembering memories, going through memories, very helpful to individuation, because then you can see the influence, you can see where you came from. Thank you so much for your support, guys. Thank you. Means a lot. Thank you, ATI. Okay, so as we link, so this kind of linking memories with present situations is very helpful, especially when we are dealing with emotional flashbacks. So if any of you is suffering from complex PTSD, very common pattern, you're going to experience this emotional flashback. So emotional flashbacks is like putting you in a loop. It's like looping through the same reactions over and over again, looping through the same patterns, looping through the same reactions, beliefs, thoughts, interpretations. So the way to get out of these flashbacks, as I was saying, is to link present situations with past memories. So are you really interpreting your present moment experience as it is, based on facts, or are you using this past filter? So that requires this awareness and mindfulness and paying attention. For those of you interested in schema therapy, there's a very helpful book called Reinventing Your Life. So that book describes many different schemas and three different kind of coping styles that we can adapt to deal with certain schemas. But I think it's super, super helpful when we are learning in this process of gaining meta-awareness, when we are learning to interpret our experience and what is happening based on facts, based on things that are happening right now, not based on past situations. So all this process, it takes time. So as you are learning to step back, to investigate, to question your perspective, to question your interpretation, right? As you are linking present moment experiences with past memories, past situation, right? You are developing this meta understanding where you can start seeing how you developed certain beliefs, how you developed certain schemas, in a sense, how you develop certain conclusions that might be repeating in your life. And as you are doing that, there's probably going to be, most likely, there's going to be lots of unprocessed emotions from the past. So when you're reacting to the present moment situation, right, that resembles past situation you've been in, the emotional reaction you are having is most likely not about the present situation, but about that past event. So you need to go through it, especially when you start linking these memories to current things in your life. And going through these emotional reactions will free you to some extent from reacting so strongly, because next time your friend annoys you, again, you're having some emotional reaction, you're going to recognize, okay, it's the same thing that happened before, and it relates to maybe my mother getting angry at me in the past. So you see here how you start to validate parts of you. You start to validate your emotions. You start to bring together different parts of you. So it is, in some ways, kind of similar to, maybe even the same, it's just a little different language to what Jung was saying about having different parts of you, like the shadow or the anima and animus, right? It's just that he provided this way of using symbols, using these metaphors for underlying processes. Schema therapy also has a similar language. So there's like a detached protector or the vulnerable child. So different mechanisms, different parts of you that might be coming out in different situations. So knowing these different parts of you, or given their names, right? You could use Jungian terminology, you could use the schema therapy terminology, whichever works for you, or you could start naming these parts yourself. It's very helpful if you give them names, because they're going to be recurring. As you're freeing yourself from this unconscious patterns or from this kind of past hijacking your present moment experience, you're going to see repeating patterns. That's why having names for these patterns can be helpful, because then you remember better. Or you could assign colors, you could assign sounds, or you could assign metaphors. So anything that works for you, so that you can map or develop this accurate map of who you are as a person. So if you see repeatedly, maybe 10 times a year, that a certain individual person annoys you, or that you have this strong reaction, what sort of person, what sort of part of you is coming out in that moment? You could give it a name, like I don't know, Angry Joe or something, right? So you see here that the next time, as you gave a name to this part, you're going to know exactly where's it coming from, where it's happening. So you are kind of overwriting the past schemas with more accurate understanding. You're overwriting them with more accurate interpretation of what is happening. And at the same time, you develop greater and greater freedom, because then you don't have to use these old ancient patterns, right? This old part of you, but you can start focusing on what is happening right now. Is schema and trauma the same thing? Or trigger points, Igor asks. Trauma, I mean, I would imagine there are some overlaps depending on perspective. But from my opinion, I think that trauma is like this general broad thing that happened. So general situation that happened. And then schema is like the conclusion that you drew from that situation. That's how it's interpreted. So with a trauma, it's like the whole event with different sensations, different feelings, different people involved, different things that have been happening. And then schema is like the conclusion. So it's the interpretation of that experience that you're having. Oh yeah, a schema, yeah, Waslow actually replied and said exactly the same thing. It's like an addiction. You need to replace it with better habits. Which Reinventing Yourself book is it? Let me double check the whole title. The whole title of this book is, just a minute, Reinventing Your Life, the Breakthrough Program to End Negative Behavior and Feel Great Again. So it's kind of cheesy, but don't get mistaken with the title. It has lots of valuable information on schemas, and it doesn't use the kind of, you know, technical or psychological jargon that some people might be using. It's directed to a wider people. So if you have an experience in psychology, or if you don't, I think it's just a high value book, especially if you want to learn about yourself and are there any recurring patterns in your life. So the last thing I got sidetracked a little bit. So the last thing I was saying that could be helpful in this process of individuation and developing greater autonomy. Again, we are focusing on developing this more and more accurate perspective, more and more accurate interpretation of our experience. The last thing I've said about kind of recognizing different parts of you, giving them names. So you could use, again, schema therapy for that. You could use Jungian terminology. Although Jungian terminology doesn't go as precise, in my opinion. if I had to choose for breaking these patterns, I would go with schema therapy personally. At the same time, Jungian perspective is more helpful with dealing with more unconscious things, more kind of deeper things within ourselves, maybe deeper patterns, different, or maybe even kind of more collective. So things like the shadow, it's a very general, broad idea, right? So you could break it down probably in different schemas. But if you go deeper accordingly to Jungian perspective, right, there's also the anima and animus. So that kind of opens a gate for even greater awareness and understanding of yourself and other people, and greater autonomy and freedom. But the more deeper you, in my opinion, the deeper you go into the unconscious, right, the more collective it becomes, and at the same time, the more symbolic it also is. So using language probably is not going to be very helpful at some point, right? As you start to perceive certain patterns in your life, it could be helpful to some extent to describe these experiences, especially with anima and animals. But I think symbols or images could be way more helpful in that process. But I'm going to leave the deeper and unconscious for another live stream. So it's all about developing again this accurate map of yourself, of the reality around you, so that you're not entangled into these little processes or into the defense mechanisms, but you become independent of them, so that you have greater and greater freedom of choice in your life to act in life, or to act in relationships in more authentic way. Because I don't think it's very authentic to act through this kind of patterns that might be ruling your behaviors. So obviously in that process, I think it takes lots of self-care, because as you will be encountering different schemas or different patterns or different memories, that's going to bring up lots of feelings and emotions that might be uncomfortable to deal with. But we need to resist this urge to push them away. We need to be able to resist this urge to dismiss them or reject them. But we need to stay with the process and accept that your reaction to what happened to you in the past, for example, is valid. And then as you're validating your past, it's going to be easier to validate the present moment as well. So I think I covered most of it. Oh, and the last point I wanted to mention, that was kind of when I was talking about the anima and animus and the more collective unconscious. Although in personal unconscious could be helpful too, in more closer to the surface. Dreams can be very helpful too. But again, this is a very symbolic world. And I think that unless we do this personal work first, unless we start freeing ourselves from the patterns that hijack our perception, hijack our interpretation, then it's not really worth to going that deep with your development, with your kind of self-inquiry. Thank you, Chelsea 100. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. Thank you so much. Hope to see you next time. Okay, so I think that's, again, I think I covered most of the things. Do you guys have any questions, or is there anything else you would like to add to this list? I did try to get practical with this live stream, but maybe there's something I'm missing. So if you do have any questions, I'm happy to, bounce some ideas off. I don't promise that I have an answer to everything, because I don't. It's all just brainstorming and, creative process. So if there's anything you want to add, or if there's any questions, I'm still here. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you so much for your support and, just being here and joining this live stream. So you all guys, super valuable, because you actually help me to create this content. So as you're participating in these discussions, as you're sharing your thoughts, it also gets easier for me to formulate my thoughts and ideas, so then we can, move forward in live stream. So becoming aware of schemas show us areas of us that we need to work, and this would help self-actualization, Igor asks. It would help the process, whether you can call it self-actualization or individuation, because you can start recognizing patterns in your life. So patterns in your life, it's like doing things on autopilot, right? So someone says something, you react, you do something else then, right? Someone says something, you react, you go and do something. So you see that this kind of patterns, there is not much agency in the process where we're doing things automatically. There's not much awareness, there's not much consciousness. So yes, in that sense, schemas will help the process of developing greater agency. Have you read Critic of Pure Reason? Kevin asks. Nope, I'm sorry, but I didn't. Daniel says, I've never really understood how anima and animals are helpful and how they can employ without assuming rigid gender roles. Does feminine male, for example, have an anima or animus? Yeah, I think it's a very complex subject once we start getting too much into gender roles. So, especially these times, it's a very sensitive subject, and I'm not sure I want to go that direction because it's a little bit like wrestling in the mud. But in a broad sense, from the Jungian perspective, so very black and white, anima and animus is this kind of spiritual bridge in a sense, or bridge towards your true self. So it's like a very intuitive, very symbolic part of you that might fuel your creativity, might fuel your decisions. So in that sense, it's like a little bit like an advisor, maybe, in its fullest developed form. Is it harder for creative individuals to individuate? And if so, are there specific processes of creative individuals should approach? That depends on the perspective, because from the one side, I think creative people have actually easier because they probably have mastered this more symbolic, intuitive realm. So it's easier to observe patterns. It's easier to spot patterns or repeated things in our lives. At the same time, I think many creative individuals might have it more difficult in terms of being too abstract, too removed from the practicalities of life. So if there are some specific processes a creative individual should approach, that would depend, obviously on yourself and on your preferences. But the general ideas, the general tips and strategies I gave in this live stream would apply to creative individuals as well. So basically, meta-awareness, step back, reflect on how you interpret your experience, reflect on how you're interacting with other people and where your reactions are coming from. So the goal here is to develop an accurate perspective on the reality, accurate perception of the reality, accurate interpretation, so that when you interact with someone and they have the reaction to you, you know it's their reaction, it's coming from them, and it's not directed to you, most likely. It seems that way, but it's just someone having a reaction. That's just one example. Okay, so last question. Daniel would love a video explaining someday. Another Jungian feminist. I wonder what their take is, as in Jungian feminist theories. They probably are. And in psychoanalysis, I think feminists brought in quite an interesting perspective to psychoanalysis in general. But that was probably years ago. Okay, so again, thank you so much for all your support, guys. Thank you for being here tonight or today, depending on where you are in the world. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day or evening or morning, and I hope to see you all in the next live stream. Take care of yourself, guys. Bye.